Good evening, a huge welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight, and I'm very excited to be hosting this panel because it is such an endlessly fascinating subject, and we have two of the country's most foremost experts in this area with us, and delighted as well to join Dan on the panel once again. Let's start with you, Dan, by asking, so I'm sure many things cross your desk, ideas, pitches, all sorts of things. What was your interest in this kind of material and then seeking out experts of the quality of Mark and Douglas?
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Great that so many came out tonight. I think that there were a few things that inspired us to do this, and the first, actually, was our great team in Warsaw. The Polish team originally came up with this idea of making a series called Once Upon a Crime, and it was originally produced with Polish authors talking about the true crimes that had inspired their fiction. And so that was the first thing. I think the second thing is that when you are responsible for programming at a channel like Crime+Investigation, you're always seeking a different way into true crime, a different way of sort of understanding it. What you don't want to do is you don't want to keep on repeating the things you've done previously, because crime can quickly become, I think, quite repetitive and sensationalist, and with a tagline like "Truth is worth pursuing," it's incumbent upon us to find new angles, and that's really what this series did. Thirdly, it gave us the opportunity to work with a brilliant production company, IWC, and we've got Mark Downey and Liam McArdle, who did such a fantastic job in stewarding the series through. And sort of fourth and finally, it gave us an opportunity to work with some brilliant writers. I'm really thrilled that Mark and Douglas have managed to make it here with us today. And Denise, who sadly can't be here, Denise Mina and Peter James. It is really fascinating to work with such great writers because they do naturally come at this material in a very unique way. And that was, we were the beneficiaries of that. And that's why I think each film has its own personality. And each film is very striking in its own way.
Well, at risk of embarrassing them, and before we hear from Mark and Douglas, why did you particularly, you've mentioned all four, we have these two with us tonight, what was it about them that made you, as you say, it's a huge market. We have enormous, we're spoilt for crime writers in this country.
Yeah.
So what was it about this particular pair and the other two?
Well, I think, sparing their blushes, they've sold an enormous number of books between them. But I think that the attraction was both in the personality and the subject matter. And I think that we sort of were talking about it previously, is that each crime in the series says something rather different about Britain at that stage. And obviously Denise's film is set in 1950s in the East End of Glasgow, and talks about that period and what was happening in that great city at the time. Mark and the Moors murders is very much a crime that's sort of born of the 1960s and a very bleak period in a very bleak part of the country. And Douglas will talk about it far better than I could, but that sort of 1980s Glasgow and very much at the sort of teeth of Thatcher's Britain and those communities that were left behind. The ice cream war murders came out of that. And then Peter and Brighton and the Babes in the Wood murders. And that was an extraordinary one because it hit the headlines as it was being made. So two things happened. First of all, Russell Bishop, the killer's girlfriend who'd given him an alibi, was charged and convicted of perjury. And the next thing that happened was that Martin Bashir, who was in the middle of this very unseemly inquiry about the conduct of the Princess Diana interview, the other thing that he'd been responsible for was losing the clothing of one of the little girls who had died in Babes in the Wood murder. So then again, that hit the headlines. So I think it was a fusion of great writers and great material.
Okay, and just finally from you, Dan, at the moment, what do you hope that audiences will get from watching this? As I said, there's a lot of crime drama. This is something different.
Yeah.
This is fictional writers and experts in this genre applying their skills to these histories, these very all too real histories. What are you hoping that audiences will get from that?
Well, I think that true crime audiences are spoilt for choice at the moment. They've got a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of, I won't mention our competitors and rivals for fear of bigging them up, but I hope that what they'll get from this is that this is a very unique take, and it's very much an authored take, and Mark and Douglas and Denise and Peter do so brilliantly is to really own these films and tell you about the crimes from, I think, a very unique perspective.
They do feel very personal. I think I do very much encourage people to go in with these very expert hands to guide us. So who should we start with? Mark. So why were you interested in taking this approach? I mean, you've written an enormous number of books. You could just be forgiven for staying in your attic with your own laptop and your imagination, but instead this was something quite different.
Well, absolutely echo what Dan said about not wanting to tell the same story twice. And I think, you know, we would apply that to our books, and I think the same is true of a show like this. But it so happened that about a week before I got the call to say, you know, would you be interested in taking part, I read an article in the newspaper, and it was an article about the death penalty, and it was about how the names of Hindley and Brady are always brought up whenever that debate surfaces, as it does with dreary inevitability every 10 years or so. Should we bring back the death penalty? And they always talk about Hindley and Brady, and it hadn't struck me. I've written about Hindley and Brady and made other documentaries about Hindley and Brady, but not about the fact that they escaped the death penalty by a matter of weeks. You know, the legislation was going through the House of Lords while they were on trial.
What year was this?
65.
Right.
So, you know, what happened was suddenly the prison system had to cope with two offenders that the like of which they'd never had to handle before. What do we do with these people? We don't have prisoners like this. So that it felt like we could come at the story from a different angle. It's all about what happened after they were caught and convicted, rather than just a rehash of their terrible crimes. You know, it's probably the most written about crime the last 100 years. So you've got to find a new way to come at it. So what we wanted to tell was the story of what happened to the two of them after they were imprisoned, their continuing relationship and how that developed and fractured. And so for me, that was too tempting.
Fantastic, thank you. And Douglas, I mean, this is on not quite your back doorstep, because as you've explained, you're a North Glaswegian, but it is from your city.
Yeah.
But how steeped were you in this story? And then what was the appeal of bringing that to the screen?
Well, the original case took place in the early 1980s, 1984. So at that time I was working elsewhere, but I would be aware of the case. I wasn't looking at it from the point of view of a writer at all, because it was incredibly interesting to the Glaswegian public. It was all over the papers, it was on the local TV, because it was an absolutely horrendous case. But it wasn't until the early 90s.
So would you like, just why was it so horrendous? Just for people who haven't
It's
seen
what they call the Ice Cream War murders is related to a trade war in Glasgow in the early 80s between ice cream van operators. And according to the court case and according to the Crown, it culminated in a fire in a home and 6 people died, including an 18-month-old child. And it was all linked, they said, to this trade war. I didn't become involved until the early 90s, when I was asked. My first book was a true crime book. It was a compendium of Scottish murder cases. And the publishers asked me to do a chapter on the ice cream wars. And I said, yes, no problem, because I was desperate to get published. And I started to do the research, and I thought, well, I'll go and speak to this solicitor guy who's representing one of the accused. The accused was Thomas Campbell, was his name. And both he and his co-accused, Joseph Steele, consistently proclaimed their innocence from 1984, so this was 1991. So I saw the solicitor, John Carroll, and explained what I was going to do, and he said, oh, no, you'll never do this in a chapter. And I said, oh, yes, of course I would. And he said, no, come with me. And he took me into this room in his office, and it was piled from floor to ceiling with files and folders and bits of paper. And he said, that's the Thomas Campbell file. He said, if you want to do this right, you will go through every single bit of paper and draw your own conclusions. So the gauntlet was thrown down. I picked it up, And I brought in a friend, Lisa Brownlee, and together we started researching, and it culminated in a book about, it was 6 months later, believe it.
Did you read all the files?
Yes, between the two of us. That's why I had to bring Lisa in, because I can't read. She had to read it to me. But it was a 6 month intensive bit of research, reading these, talking to people, interviewing, writing. And the book came out, it was called Frightener. And that was me for the next 10 years. I was with the case, I was with the campaign for 10 years to get these two guys back into the appeal court.
Okay, so, and then why the leap to the screen?
They asked me, is the short answer, but I felt it was time. I'd appeared, like Mark, I'd done documentaries before, but I'd just been a talking head. A contributor. This was an opportunity for me to present the story, and also to try and get across that I really do believe that there should be some sort of inquiry into this case.
Right.
Because there's no appetite for it in Scotland, in the authorities, in the Crown Office, and the police. 6 people died in a quite horrendous fire. 2 men were convicted of the murders, and it looks as if they didn't do it. And they were cleared by the appeal court. And yet there's no inquiry into this case.
Hold that thought. Shall we run the first clip, which is about these ice cream wars that Douglas is referring to? Can we run the first clip, please?
In 1984 in Glasgow's East End, a turf war being fought to gain control of lucrative ice cream van routes seemed to be escalating. Being involved in the trade could be bad for your health, as targeted attacks by rival van owners became commonplace. And on the evening of the 16th of April, Andrew Doyle was once again the target. He lived with his parents and 3 brothers in a top-floor flat in Bank End Street. The flat was unusually crowded that night. Andrew's eldest brother Jim was there because his wife had given birth at a nearby hospital only the day before. The Doyles' daughter Christine was also in the house that night. She'd had a bad row with her husband, so had moved back temporarily with her baby son, Mark. Between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m, somebody crept up the tenement stairs carrying a can of petrol. They splashed it round the wooden front door and the door to the storeroom beside it. That contained old cans of paint, some tyres, some wood, and a bedspread. The attacker then put a match to the petrol-soaked wood. Soon the tyres and the paint exploded into flames.
Doors just don't go and fire on their own. Somebody has to do something, and it was obvious at that point it was willful fire raising. The big problem was the people in the house and getting them out.
Onlookers below watched helplessly as one of the brothers, holding the family dog, jumped from his 4th-floor window. Living only a few streets away in Garthamlock, Joe Steele heard about the blaze on the radio. When you heard about the fire, how did you feel? What was your reaction?
I was in my ma's. My granny was no well. She had a wee tranny. She used to listen to the VHF, like a scanner, like a post, thinking it came out about a fire in Bank End Street at the time. And I said to my ma, a fire in Bank End Street, occupants trapped. I remember saying, God bless us and save us. And that was the first time I'd ever heard. It was horrendous, right bad, horrendous.
So you're completely versed in this story. I mean, these are details that have been in your head for a decade or more by now. What's the biggest challenge about bringing that story to screen? I mean, I'm guessing there are darlings that have to be killed every which way.
Yeah, I mean, that you have, 45 minutes to tell a very complex, very involved story. There are subtleties, obviously, that we just can't get at in that time frame. So that's the biggest challenge.
Right. But people know that there is a book available.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's now out of print, but yeah.
Can we run the second clip?
One of the reasons the story weighs so heavily on my mind is the strangest letter I have ever received. It's handwritten from Ian Brady himself, sent to me in 2005.
I was researching a different documentary at the time and wrote to Brady requesting an interview. I wasn't expecting a reply, but I got one. It's largely a selection of random complaints and grievances from Brady, bearing almost no relevance to the interview, which never happened, by the way. I've never forgotten this letter, but now I've come to realise that I'm far from alone in receiving correspondence from this infamous killer.
During their lifetimes, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley generated an astonishing amount of correspondence and documentation. Whether letters, prison reports, or newspaper articles. I believe that only by following this trail of evidence will the unresolved questions in this case finally be answered. Was Hindley a willing participant in these hideous crimes, or was she, as she claimed, an unwilling accomplice?
She was the facilitator. I mean, small children don't go off with strange men, so because she was picking up the children, she was facilitating it.
How were the pair allowed to continually taunt the police and torment their victims' families from behind bars?
There's a part of him that believed that he was of great importance and was above other human beings.
And the biggest question of all,
will the body of Keith Bennett, the last remaining victim buried on the moors, ever be discovered?
We have reasonable suspicion that there's documents there in someone's possession that might identify the location of human remains.
The notoriety is the biggest thing that you take into this documentary. So, as you say, the challenge is to take that story forward. How did you go about moving the story forward?
Well, we focused largely on what happened between Hindley and Brady after they were imprisoned. Mm-hmm. And also looking at what was mentioned at the end there, we discovered that there are these suitcases that were discovered very late on that Brady left in the care of his solicitor, 2 locked suitcases that for all manner of bizarre legal reasons the police can't open. They're not allowed to open them. There's some kind of legislation at work at the moment which may enable the police to open them. But while the contents of those suitcases are unknown, there is this little bit of hope that it may contain something.
How did you feel when you received that letter from him?
I remember my wife didn't want to have it in the house. Seriously, she said, get rid of it. And I filed it away somewhere. It's bizarre. It's the most bizarre letter. Firstly, he's just moaning about how badly they're treating him. Well, boo-hoo, Ian. And also, in a sort of Hannibal Lecter way, he wanted me to know how clever he was. He literally was telling me what his IQ was, and very, very strange. But so much of it is kind of surface. I mean, we found out that, the infamous hunger strike that he was on because he wanted to die and he was being fed by tube, he just used to hoard cream eggs and Mars bars and stuff them down his face when nobody was looking. It was all it was all an act, and he was very good at playing people. But, I still think they've had probably enough stage time now.
Well, this is the question, isn't it? Because everyone talks about the myth-making that particularly Ian Brady was so involved in. I mean, profound narcissism and on steroids and the rest. How do you avoid contributing to the mythology that he clearly pursued?
By making it clear that they are not, in inverted commas, monsters. I mean, this is something that I've always felt very strongly about. It's very easy to go, that's a monster. We put them in a box marked monster, and then we can go, that's not us, that's other people. And that doesn't help try and explain why these things happen, ever. Because, people that do acts like that commit acts like that, they are not like Hannibal Lecter. They're not evil geniuses. They're doctors and builders and the bloke next door and the friendly teacher and until we kind of accept that, rather than going, let's put them in a box and let's call them evil and the personification of evil, I just think we need to come at it from a different way. I mean, there's no question. I mean, one of the most interesting documents I came across was during one of Hindley's numerous parole applications, was this hand-scrawled note from Margaret Thatcher scrawled across this letter from Leon Britton, basically saying, over my dead body, I will not let this woman out. And you kind of go, I've never heard of that happening before, a Prime Minister taking that personal interest in something that's actually outside her, But she ended up spending, best part of 50 years in prison, and I don't know. I mean, it's very unpopular to say I think she should have been paroled, but I think she should have been.
On what basis?
On the basis that she'd done her time. And I mean, there are people that doubt that she had the various conversions she had when she was in prison, religious conversions and all sorts, Lord Longford getting involved and all that sort of stuff. It would have been difficult to release Brady. I see that, but I think Hindley deserved to be paroled.
Okay. I should have added, of course, at the beginning that you are almost welcome to pitch your questions to Mark, Douglas and Dan at the end of the session. So I've got a handful and then we will be turning the mics over. So anything I forget to ask, please do pitch in. But if we can just carry on for a bit, because I'm fascinated. I mean, you spend your lives immersed in this quite dark matter. Did you start out as happier, more cheerful, optimistic people?
I used to be a comedian. I'm just, but it's like the flip side of it. I don't know.
Yeah.
The simple truth is that actually most crime writers are quite sort of happy-go-lucky. They're not sort of dark, shadowy figures in the corner. They're the people propping up the bar, having a laugh and talking. I mean, they genuinely are. Is that because we get all our badness out on the page? I don't know. Is it because we feel like we're at the fringes of the literary community, so we just want to be the naughty boys and girls in the corner having fun? There's a bit of that. There's definitely somebody once described crime writers as the smokers of the literary community. And I've always liked that. I've always liked that description.
Would you agree that, are you a smoker of the literary community?
Well, I wrote. I'm from Glasgow. I either wrote about it or I did it. So I don't know. I can't. I don't bite the heads off live chickens anymore.
Good.
But I don't know what drew me to it. I know that from my teens I was reading crime novels. Yeah. So I remember in my teens I discovered the books of Ed McBain, an American crime writer, and I devoured them over the next few years. So I think it was, and I got into writing true crime, which I did prior to the fiction career, through journalism, because I became a journalist in a local paper in the West End of Glasgow, and the editor just said, "Oh, by the way, you're the crime reporter as well." And I thought, thanks very much for that. And I was sent round the police stations in our area every week to get the crime reports. Yeah. So from there, it went on, and I started to write features for the Glasgow Evening Times on past crimes. And that led to the first book, and then another book, and another book, and that led to fiction, which I always wanted to write. There are some police officers out there that said I was writing fiction all the time, but and they may well be right.
Right. I see. I wonder what it is. I mean, obviously there is a meatiness to crime. I mean, yes, you read it as a child. Who was your first crime novelist?
Sherlock Holmes, because we had a crazy. Writers always say they have a teacher that influenced them, but mine was a maths teacher who just got bored in his own lessons. He'd teach us about 15 minutes and go, "God, this is tedious," and he'd reach into this battered old leather bag and he would read us The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And we're like, this is fantastic, which is why I love crime fiction, but I can't add up, essentially. But so, yeah, it was Sherlock Holmes. I mean, I think the thing is, crime fiction will always tell you a story. There are books can do all sorts of things, of course, but at the heart of crime fiction, there's always a story.
You're guaranteed a plot.
Well, yeah, I guess you are. You are pretty much guaranteed a beginning, a middle, and end with some form of resolution at the end, whether neatly tied up in a bow or with some grey areas. It will always tell a story, and human beings are hardwired to look for story. And that's kind of what this show does. We're taking fairly infamous crimes, but looking at them, from a narrative, trying to what's the engine? What's the engine of the story in here? And story comes from character. So who are the characters telling the story? And I guess that's why. And we just love nasty stuff.
Nasty stuff, yeah.
But it's not new. I mean, crime fiction, crime writing is as old as the Bible. I mean, Cain slew Abel.
Lots of slewing,
lots of slewing.
And begetting.
Lots of
begetting as well.
We won't talk about that tonight. No. I'm at a funny age. So over the centuries, there has always been some sort of crime writing, I would say. And it rose in the 19th century, thanks to the development of the paperback, the old yellowbacks, and books being on sale in railway stands, and most of them were about crime.
Yeah. And it is a massive umbrella. I mean, that's why it is so popular, because there's the coziest of the cozy out there, if that's what you want. If you go into what they call mystery bookstores in America, You will see, you know, cat mysteries, cooking mysteries, cat and cooking mysteries, real estate mysteries, golf mysteries. I mean, there is
Do they get their own
everybody.
markers?
Oh, completely.
Right.
And then you've got historical stuff, crime novels set in space. There's everything for anybody out there. And it's why crime fiction and crime drama on TV are so endlessly popular. And, of course, I would state boldly that crime writers are writing the social novels of our time.
Well, OK, hold that thought. Dan, I just want to ask you, who was the crime novelist that you ate or enjoyed?
Well, yes, I grew up on Mark Billingham.
Yeah.
I love all sorts of crime fiction. I mean, I was also sort of, you know, Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie and Raymond Chandler, and you know, I mean, you know, it was sort of both American and British fiction, I think. So yeah, I mean, I loved it, but there is a hook to crime, as you say. They are the best stories. That's why people come to them, because they are a sort of gripping social commentary, but they're also just brilliant stories. I think with these films as well, there's a sense of unfinished business. You know, when you look at Joe Steele up there as I do, and think, well, he spent his entire life was ruined by what effectively was a miscarriage of justice. You know, so there isn't any justice for the Doyle family. There isn't any justice for Joe Steele and T.C. Campbell. So the question is, who did set fire to that house? You know, why? You know, this is a botched inquiry. I mean, it's similar with the Moors murders, and you think the manipulation that Brady carried on, you know, via the prison system was not only outrageous, but I mean, as you say, it was the first time the prison system had to deal with those kind of characters. But the fact is, there is still a body on the moors somewhere, Keith Bennett's body, and sure, you know, I went up there once with his mother, who was an extraordinary character, force of nature, called Winnie Johnson, who, you know, and until she died, her dearest wish was that she outlive Brady, and sadly she didn't manage to do that. But again, there is a sense with all these things, and Denise's film really is based around this extraordinary encounter that Peter Manuel, the serial killer, had with William Watt. They went on an 11-hour bar crawl. And this is Peter Manuel, who allegedly had killed William Watt's wife, sister-in-law, daughter. And they went on a bar crawl together, and the suggestion is, in Denise's book, that actually William Watt had actually hired a hitman to bump off his family, and the gun ended up in Peter's hands. So all of these have a real twist and a turn to them, and there is that sense of unfinished business, which I think every film carries, which is why you go back into it again. You go back into that material again. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, we'll ask you about your unfinished business with the ice cream wars, but could we play the third clip, please, which is also the ice cream wars? Thank you.
In 1984, Joseph Steele and Thomas Campbell had been sentenced to life in prison for the murders of 6 members of the Doyle family in a horrifying fire attack. An alleged act of intimidation born out of Glasgow's ice cream wars, which had gone horribly wrong. But this was a case that was far from closed. The 2 men persisted in their claims that they were innocent and had been fitted up by the police.
I've never killed anyone in my life. Never. The fire at Fat Boys was only meant to be a frightener which went too far. I never said that. I just never said it. It's as simple as that.
The 2 convicted men would lose an appeal against the convictions, but always protested their innocence, a claim that Joe Steele maintains to this day. Well, this is the side of the High Court building. Where would you have been brought out on that final day?
That door there.
And then what happened after that?
We come up for the cells, came out here, the prison van that went to was further down there, so we had to come out that door there, walk right down there, past all the press, all the photographers, all the public sitting up there shouting and screaming and whatnot. We had to walk down there. Basically what they were doing is that we had to walk by all the press, that's what they arranged it to, so they get their photographs and whatnot, the so-called ice cream killers.
When you think about Joe and Tommy, you wonder how many other men and women were the victims of miscarriages of justice, because at the time, judges could not believe that police officers would perjure themselves in court.
Perjuring themselves in court, that's quite defiant, controversial statement to put out there, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's Mr. Anwar's position. Certainly, there are questions that have to be asked, as I said earlier, and they haven't been asked. As Dan said, if Thomas Campbell and Joseph Steele did not do that, then somebody else did. And that means that somebody else was possibly free all this time.
Out there right now.
And could still be free. And there is no appetite to look into it again.
Why not?
I don't know. That's what I'd love to know. Why will they not look into it? Why won't they reopen it somehow? They have all the information. They have things that, you know, bits and pieces of evidence that I didn't have access to, theoretically, because we know that they'd lost some as well. So why won't they look into it?
Is it your sense of justice that fuels your research?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound, you know, pompous about it, but yes. Because when Lisa and I started doing this, we didn't know if they were innocent. In fact, we thought they were probably guilty. And it was as we...
Which would have made for quite a much shorter documentary.
Yeah. It was as we moved into it, as we get further into it and spoke to more and more people, discovered bits and pieces, that we thought, this just doesn't hold together. And that's the point of it. They were convicted on very, very shaky evidence.
Why do you think, then? Why do you think they were put in the frame and people were so happy? Well, particularly, as you say, the police, the judge, the jury. Why was it slam dunk for them?
I call it prime suspect syndrome. And that when Thomas Campbell's name, he was a known criminal, although he claims he was going straight-ish at the time. I asked him, what do you mean by straight-ish? He said, well, because he operated a van run as well. He said, well, I wasn't nicking the stuff, but I'd sell it off the back of the van. So that was his idea. And that's what it was all about as well, was about reset, as we call it, fencing of stolen goods. So his name came into the frame, and I think the way that some officers possibly thought at the time is he must have done it. And then instead of following the evidence, it was all the evidence that fits. So Thomas Campbell had another theory. He's dead now, but he told me that they wanted him to implicate somebody else, and he refused to do that. And a police officer said, well, if you don't do that, we're going to do you for it.
Right.
So that's what he said. Obviously, there's no evidence to that effect. There was only him and the police officer in the room, but that's what he said. So it's a difficult thing. Why would they? Why would they do something like this? And of course, Joe Steele was just caught up in the slipstream of it all. He was just a teenager. He was in his late teens at the time. And he was just caught up in it all and swept away, because there were about, 6, 7, 8 accused originally, and one by one the charges against the others fell away over the 6-week trial. And eventually on the most important charge in this massive indictment, the murder charge, there was only Thomas Campbell and Joseph Steele.
So actually, to prevent them being humiliated by the collapse of the trial, everyone involved on the prosecution side needed to pin their chips on the outcome.
Obviously they had to get a conviction.
Yeah,
this was a dreadful, dreadful crime. Huge public interest, lots of pressure from the public, from politicians, from the press. Immense pressure on them to get a conviction. They would want a conviction. Now, the question is, as people who watch the documentary will see, there was some evidence that is open to doubt. Did they pursue that evidence properly? Did they check what these individuals was telling them? Or did they just accept it at face value because it fitted what they wanted them to say?
Confirmation bias.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's what I mean. The whole, the entire thing needs to be looked at independently, dispassionately. We're not going to get it.
It's not cheap, is it?
Yeah, we're not going to get it now. Not at this rate.
But you'll carry on trying.
Well, I'll keep asking for it.
Yeah. Well. Mark, why do you think? Okay, let's just park the Moors murderers, but maybe we do have to refer to them because for the answer to this question. Why do certain crimes catch the public imagination? Like you said, I mean, your man up there said we don't know how many people are suffering from injustice, rotting away in cells, but certain crimes stay on the front pages for years. Look at, Madeleine McCann, you know, we still get updates from certain cases. What is it? What are the ingredients?
I think as far as Hindley and Brady are concerned, I think the thing that made the crime so notorious was Hindley. There were children involved, which there's no question that the crimes that were committed were utterly horrendous. I mean, utterly barbaric, and could not be more different from Doug's case. This was not about gangsterism. This was not about profit. This was about nothing other than Brady's bizarre notions based on kind of Nazi ideology and all sorts of weird stuff, that he was somehow above everybody else and could get away with anything he fancied. and what's interesting is that at the original trial, he was completely defensive of Hindley. There was still a couple, there was still an item, and it was all me. She had nothing to do with it until she sort of went her own way in prison and started having affairs in prison and was not with him anymore, and then she's applying for parole. Oh no, that's broken our pact. Oh, she did loads more. She was much more involved than I said she was at the trial.
So which one of those do you think was accurate?
Well, I mean, as you saw in the film, she was certainly involved in getting the children into the car, taking them up onto the moors. She knew what was going on, and on the horrendous Leslie Ann Downey tape, which thankfully I've not, which apparently has been destroyed. I don't know whether that's true or not, but some people think it's been destroyed. She is threatening the child. She's telling the child to shut up. It's all fairly horrendous. But Hindley was not insane. I don't think there was, Hindley did what she did, and this is in no way an excuse or nothing of the sort, but it's an explanation. Brady was clinically insane, voices, visions, the whole lot. Hindley did what she did because she loved him. Now that's weirder to me. That's far weirder than doing something because of, mental health issues. To do the worst things possibly imaginable to prove your love to somebody is extremely dark. And I kind of think that's why that case, whether they are the personification of evil, I'm not sure about that. And it's those pictures. One of the most amazing things was I saw pictures of Ian Brady that have never been made public before, where I promise you he was probably the most handsome man. It's a strange thing to say, the most handsome man I've ever seen. He looked like a rock star. Unbelievable. He looked like David Bowie. And the idea of him walking into this office where Myra Hindley is, this grim office in the early 60s, and here's this incredibly glamorous man in a long leather coat with a copy of Mein Kampf. He reads books. Oh my God, she was absolutely dazzled. But all we remember are those pictures, are those two famous mugshots that are fixed in our imagination, washed out and bleached, and you look at them and go, oh yes, look at them, evil.
You would, yeah. You kind of bring to mind sort of Pinky from Brighton Rock. That kind of the person who would catch the eye and charismatically
he
draw
was incredibly charismatic.
Right.
Incredibly charismatic.
Can we play the fourth clip, please? The second Moors Murders clip. Thank you.
Feeling that she was free from Brady's influence, Hindley underwent a transformation in Holloway Prison in the 1970s.
She went back to her Catholic religion. She became very much a leader in prison, and she had her acolytes around her, and she developed a very active lesbian life.
Hindley increasingly spun the narrative that she had only ever been an unwilling participant in Brady's murderous games. And it wasn't just the girls on the wing that Hindley charmed. Lord Longford, a Labour politician, legal reformer and fellow Catholic, also came under her spell.
Longford would visit long-term prisoners, and he would go and try and kind of make their conditions better. He visits Hindley and they strike up a relationship.
Longford became convinced that Hindley had reformed and argued that after 10 years in prison, she should be released.
I would say that whatever she had done, she would be entitled to be considered for parole.
Hindley's original sentence stipulated a minimum of 25 years in prison before she'd be eligible for parole. So, come 1985, with Longford's support, Hindley was perhaps no more than 5 years from release. Watching on from his cell in Durham, Brady seethed at Hindley's transformation and, more importantly, her rejection of him. Worst of all for Brady were Hindley's claims that she was an unwilling participant in the murders.
She hoped to be just his accomplice. That's what she wanted the world to see her as, a duped accomplice, not a full participant.
Desperate to derail Hindley's parole campaign, in 1985, Brady makes a stunning confession.
The three victims he and Hindley were convicted of killing in 1966 were not the only ones. He's confessing to two more murders, that of 12-year-old Keith Bennett and 16-year-old Pauline Reed. And both those bodies, he tells the police, are buried out here on the moors.
You've been researching this material for a long time, but making this documentary particularly, what did you come across that struck you afresh?
I don't think I'd been quite as aware as I am now of the amount of material, the media circus that surrounded and continues to surround these two people who are now dead. There is this stuff that goes with them, this sort of mania. And you know, we spent a whole day in the National Archive just looking through a tiny fraction of the stuff. The letters between themselves, each other, the letters from famous people to famous people, you know, and also the well, I mean, the Mars bars and cream eggs, that was a revelation. But Brady used to do this thing where he would march around his not cell room by then in Ashworth Hospital, acting out scenarios, doing the voices. He would literally have conversations between himself, the Home Secretary, and the prison governor, doing the voices, marching around. It's just bizarre. I mean, it's bizarre upon bizarre.
Something you said earlier, that crime novels are social novels.
Yes.
Expand, if you will.
Well, I think literary fiction, in inverted commas, used to be a lot of social novels in the 60s, the early 70s, and I sort of think largely that's territory that they've stepped away from. A lot of literary writers.
And gone into what? And where have they gone instead?
Oh, Hampstead dinner party novels. Don't quote me on that. But no, but a lot of crime writers have now picked that baton up, I think. I mean, what I should say is that if you set out to write a novel, you know, this is my novel about this issue or that issue, you're going to write a bad novel because as we've both stressed, story is everything. But within that, simply because detectives can go anywhere, nobody can close the door on a detective. They can go into all areas of society and occasionally shine a light into the shadows. You know, and if somewhere within your story you can do that, great. And I think a lot of modern day crime writers are doing that.
One thing, I mean, that you talk about what sort of surprised Mark about the film. The thing that sort of very much surprised me on watching it is that Brady's papers somehow are not allowed to be examined. And I found that, you know, if you've murdered 5 people, somehow you've got protection from the law. I found that peculiar.
Found it challenging.
Well, I think that obviously we don't know what's in that last. And as Mark has said, I think that more than likely Brady being psychotic and a particularly manipulative character, there's probably nothing in there. But the idea that you can't just sort of satisfy the curiosity, open it up and see, is to me utterly peculiar.
That something else would trump his human rights in death. Yeah.
You know, having deprived 5 people, well, countless people of their own human rights, somehow his are protected. I found that bizarre.
Yeah, it's a real dilemma. Dan, can you tell us a little bit about our absent friends tonight? So there are 2 other episodes as well. So let's start with Denise's episode.
Yes, well, look, I mean, I think people will know Denise Mina. She's a brilliant writer. She wrote this wonderful book called The Long Drop, and it really is sort of based on Peter Manuel and his relationship with William Watt. And as I mentioned, Manuel was a real phenomenon. I mean, he killed 8 people between, I think, 1956 and 1957. The last man to be hanged in Glasgow, I think. He was hanged in Barlinnie in 1958. And the sort of very peculiar thing, I mean, apart from his desire to kill people, the very peculiar thing was his relationship with Watt, having allegedly been responsible he was responsible for killing Watt's wife, his disabled wife, Marion, her sister, and their daughter, Watt's daughter. Originally, Watt was imprisoned for those killings. Eventually, he was allowed out due to lack of evidence, and he happened to... Actually, Manuel at the time was serving time in Billingham, so they met then. And when they were both out, they shared a solicitor, so they met in a pub, and allegedly it was William Watt trying to find information about who killed his family. And they had this 11-hour pub crawl around Glasgow. And what Denise does is quite brilliantly is sort of use that as the basis for The Long Drop, which is a fantastic book.
Let's just have a clip if we can. So this will be the 5th clip, please, and this is the Peter Manuel murders.
On the 14th of January 1958, at 6:45 in the morning, detectives pile up to the Manuel home in Birkinshaw and they arrest Peter Manuel. And this is his actual arrest sheet, which I have never seen before. And it has photographs of him. God, he's 5'3". I had no idea he was so small. And it has basic descriptions of him, peculiarities, bites nails, inveterate liar. But Peter's not the only liar in the family. The police search the house and they find items that they know were taken in a burglary in a property nearby quite recently, a camera and a pair of sheepskin gloves. And they're amongst Samuel Manuel, Peter's father's belongings. So they ask him where they got them, and he says he can't remember, he got them for Christmas. He's covering for his son once again. So the police arrest the father and the son, and they take them both into custody. Peter Manuel is taken to Hamilton Police Station, where he's kept stewing in his cell for 14 hours before eventually being questioned. The detectives confront him with an eyewitness statement. You were seen driving away from the Smarts' home, they say. Then they tell him they have a list of the numbered banknotes he stole from the Smarts' home. You spent these very notes in the Woodland Hotel on New Year's Day. We have another witness. Manuel says nothing. All he can think about is his father. The psychological pressure of Samuel's arrest begins to gnaw at him.
The police knew exactly what they were doing here.
So they're using him as leverage over Manuel because they know that's going to hurt him.
Yes.
What were you going to say about what Denise did that was really so different and novel?
Well, I think that what she did was really to try and... I mean, she says quite openly in her articles that she sort of got this slightly wrong. I mean, Peter Manuel exerts a peculiar fascination, I think, for people. He's sort of quite a glamorous figure. He's not psychotic like Brady. He's not torturing people. He's going in and just blowing them away. You know, he's using firearms and he's stealing stuff and he's sort of... I don't know. I mean, he aroused an awful lot of anger. But also he was quite a glamorous figure in some ways, I think, for some people. But I think what Denise did so brilliantly is unpack this encounter with William Watt and open up this sort of idea that William Watt actually contracted a killer in order to off his family, in order to get rid of his family, and that that this encounter with he might not have known who had been hired, but whether he knew or not, he and Manuel end up going on this pub crawl, and that's that in itself is a really extraordinary thing. So, and what Denise is just a brilliant researcher. You know, she's not only a brilliant writer, she's a brilliant researcher. So she really sort of went into it in depth, and I thought she had fantastic really screen presence as well. And
Douglas, I mean, you grew up in Glasgow knowing this story. Oh, yeah. Is this another Glaswegian legend?
Oh, Peter Manuel was the bogeyman. Mm-hmm. And for years afterwards, mothers would say to their children, "Get to your bed, or Peter Manuel will come and get you." And this is after he'd been hung. Mm-hmm. And then came Bible John, and he became the bogeyman. But it was a massive case. I mean, he was a serial killer before they were called serial killers. Mm-hmm. And he killed, members of two families, the Watts and the Smarts. In the Smart family, he actually went back after he'd killed them and spent time in the house and fed the cat. So very, very dangerous, very strange individual, known as a blowhard, an inveterate liar, as they said there. He would tell all sorts of stories, but basically I think it was totally off his head.
out of the Brady book, really.
Yeah,
Similar tendencies.
And brought to justice through the underworld as well.
Right.
Because he made the mistake of implicating a well-known Glasgow underworld figure, who then said to him personally in a police interview room, "Son, you've just made the biggest mistake of your life."
Bumped into somebody more horrible than him.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Dan, the fourth episode,
Yeah.
which is the Babes in the Wood murders, you've referred to some of the recent controversies, but can you just introduce the clip for us so that what's the background to
Yeah,
this?
I mean, this is the author Peter James, who, as is well known, he has a terrific affection for Brighton, where he lives, and this was a case which made a profound impression on him. October 1986, two 9-year-old girls, Karen Hadaway and Nicola Fellows, were found strangled and dead. And I think that the thing that Peter, that obviously he focuses on is in the fact that Russell Bishop, the killer, was involved in the sort of hunt for the girls. He was involved, he sort of made himself known. It was a little bit like the recent case with the kid, Ian Huntley. It was a little bit like Huntley. So he hunted for the girls. He gave police information that couldn't have come from anybody who hadn't killed them. So he put himself in the frame. But when it came to trial, crucially, his girlfriend gave him an alibi. And that meant that he was not convicted of these crimes for about 20 years. And, Peter talks about being along the roadside when Bishop was declared innocent and seeing this guy being paraded and all the rest of it and being a local hero. And I think that Peter became very close to the case, very close to the police officers who had done their job and felt absolutely devastated that they hadn't been able to bring this killer to justice. They knew he was guilty. And so, again, his sense of sort of personal connection to the case shines through.
Okay, thank you. Could we play the final clip, please? Sixth clip, which is the Babes in the Woods murders. Thank you.
Bishop's solicitor, Ralph Himes, is adamant his client is innocent.
And the client still strenuously denies any involvement in this offence.
With evidence against him piling up, Bishop tries to inject some doubt into the case by demanding an identity parade.
You're talking about a man who is a psychopath. There's no getting away from it. The guy is a psychopath. And he loved to think that he was the puppet master. He was orchestrating things that were going on around him.
Only 3 days after she was attacked, the 7-year-old victim will now have to be in the same room as the man who left her for dead.
I can't think of any other serial offender in history of crime that behaved in the way that Bishop did.
He's just so evil.
And I'm going to ask you in a moment to look through the window at the line of men who are sitting there.
Bishop's fate now hangs in the balance.
And they put the radios on talk-through, which means that every policeman on that channel in Brighton would hear.
I shall then ask you whether the person whom you saw on that day is here.
I think it's number 9.
She said, I think it's number 9, which was Bishop.
You think it's number 9? Thank you.
It was a drop-dead moment. It was a fabulous moment, absolutely wonderful.
You could hear people cheering. And somebody actually on the radio, some copper, I don't know who it was, pressed it and he said, about fucking time.
With a positive identification from the 7-year-old survivor and all the supporting evidence the police have been able to compile, Bishop will now face trial on charges of kidnap, indecent assault and attempted murder.
Yeah, it's amazing that little girl's voice you hear when she says, I think it's number 9. I mean, she was 7, I think, when she was attacked, 8, I think, when she, did that identity parade. Amazing, having survived that ordeal, that she actually identified him.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I have a handful of questions, but I'm aware that time is passing, and I just want to invite any members of our audience to set some questions for Mark, Douglas or Dan. Would anybody like to pose a question?
Dan, from commission to screen, how long did each episode take? And which one was the most I mean, 45 minutes, but there's hours and hours of footage, there's hours and hours of narrative to go through. What was the process in that?
Well, we're lucky to have the production team there in the back, so they can probably tell us how long. It felt like about 6 months, didn't it? The whole thing, I think, something in that.
Yeah, that very, very quickly. Yeah. And I think that sense of a writer having a unique perspective in this just gives a really clear way in. You guys.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, I think in terms of the. Each film had its own sort of complexity. I think I was just trying to sort of remember in terms of. So myself and Di Carter over there, we're in the great position of being able to receive the cuts from from the team, and it's always a privilege to read them and to watch them. And a lot of the time, you actually think, well, I'd love this to run at longer. I'd love it to run at 66 for a 90 slot, but you do have to sort of. You do have to compress it and bring it down into time, into 44 minutes, which sometimes is a shame. But certainly with these films, because I thought they all had more to give almost than they have. But they're all very, very strong films. I mean, from memory, I think the Ice Cream War Murders was probably, in some ways, the most complex because of Joe Steele's involvement and the difficulty over... Not the difficulty, but the controversy over what the vans were actually selling, whether or not, which has always been a moot point, is whether there was, stuff other than ice cream being sold out of them, which is always a tricky one. I do remember actually a conversation with Liam, which was about Joe, and funnily enough, it reminds me, watching the clip there, which is just between us, but we had a conversation about whether you would need to subtitle Joe to make him comprehensible, and I sort of but Liam put me straight that would not be acceptable, so we decided not to do it.
Lady on the fourth row, I think.
Hi, I work a lot in arts and history programmes, so this way in is a great idea. But I just wanted to ask Mark and Doug, you mentioned this evening about these stories and characters being part of media, sort of media circus. So how making these stories for television, how much do you feel that you're part of the big circus and people's appetite for it?
I think that's a very fair question. It's something I certainly asked myself, when we started. But the fact that we all had the same intention, which was to try and tell us, at least focus on an aspect of the story that hadn't been focused on before. And it's interesting. I was thinking that we spent a day filming. And none of it's in there because I think we all had reservations about. There was a particular weird place. Steve, the director's here, he'll remember. What was that? What was the bizarre museum? Little Dean. Yeah. Going through time. Yeah. There's a bizarre kind of museum exhibition place that we went to because it had some artifacts that we wanted to look at. But actually, it was just a little bit creepy and odd. And I think we were all slightly like, should we really be giving this person exposure? Because essentially he wasn't interested in the case. He was just interested in collecting grisly souvenirs. And what you don't want is the programme you're making to service that kind of an industry. So I'm very glad that was something that got left out. But yeah, it's a very fair point. I mean, I think I certainly say somewhere in the film, they've had their moment in the spotlight, but at the same time, I'm aware that I am now part of that spotlight. So it's a line you have to walk, and you have to use your best judgment, I think.
Yeah, it's a very, very fine line, I think, that you walk. In my case, with the Ice Cream Wars, it's because there are still questions. I've still got questions. The only thing I know for certain that happened in 1984 was that somebody lied. And I would like to somehow find out who it was that was lying. And that's why I keep hammering away at this idea that, for God's sake, can we not get some sort of investigation? Even after all this time, can the authorities get up off their backside and look into this case? Try and find out what happened.
Do we have any other questions?
Hi there. Just out of interest, when you're researching these cases so intensely, over such a long period of time. How hard or easy is it to maintain objectivity over it without developing some sort of attachment, if you like, towards the people you're researching?
Yeah. While we're doing the book, and it got to the stage with me that I thought, I can't do this. This is too big a story, because you're becoming more and more involved. As you say, I came to know Tommy Campbell. I didn't get to know Joseph Steele until after the book was out. But during the research for the book, we got to know Tommy Campbell because we had access to him. He was in the special unit in Berlin, so we could get in to see him. And midway through the research period, I thought, I can't do this. This is too big a story for me. And I was all for giving up. But Lisa was the one who said, no, we've got to keep on. We've got to keep on. But you do get involved. And I think I said that we approached it from the point of view of they were guilty, that the verdicts were sound, and we let what we learned perhaps show that they might not have been, and that there might have been something wrong with this case. So we had to keep taking a step back, and we had to keep bouncing things off, and that was the advantage of having two people working on that particular book, because we could bounce things off each other. One could play devil's advocate against the other. We even had a police officer, a serving police officer, whose name I won't mention, who made himself open to us, and he sat for hours with us discussing the case, and we would tell him things, and he would say, well, they shouldn't have done that, or yeah, that's what would have happened, and they'll be trying to pull the wool over your eyes, and he kept us on the right track.
I'd say just part of the joy of working with writers was that we weren't necessarily looking for completely objectivity. We were expecting them a certain amount of of themselves in the film and a certain amount of subjectivity in it, in terms of it was their interpretation and their idea, and that in a way was part of the process. You could get a completely sort of sterile, objective environment and tell those stories, but that has been done. And actually finding great writers, great journalists to sort of do it very much from their perspective meant, I think, that you had an emotional output from those films that you wouldn't otherwise have got.
And also, it's like your decision. Some writers are some writers are planners, and some writers are what are called pantsers. You fly by the seat of your pants, so you don't map everything out. And similarly with these programs, there had to be moments in it where you'd go, "What? Sorry, excuse me, what did you say?" That's taking this in a whole new direction. There has to be the element. You have to be able to be surprised. And if everything is worked out, if you've researched everything to the nth degree, then you're just sort of doing it by numbers.
Absolutely.
So I think all of us involved wanted to have the possibility of being surprised.
The curveball moment.
Yeah.
Any more questions? No? I just have a couple more before we wrap. So I just wonder, you've both been embedded in this for decades now. I wondered if you had formed any conclusions about what drives a man or a woman to such actions, and if those ideas have changed as you've spent all this time.
I think that's what we write about, basically.
Yeah.
Mark had said that all the books are different. Obviously they are, but I think the one theme is that we're exploring what drives people to commit dreadful acts.
So it's an ongoing search.
Crime fiction for the last 60-odd years has been about the why done it rather than the who done it.
Yeah. So it changes. It's a very individual answer on each occasion.
Yeah, I mean, there are still people that want puzzles to solve. They'd still rather watch Midsummer Murders, where somebody's killed with a big wheel of cheese. That's when I lost it with that show. And crossword puzzles to be solved, and there's a place for all that stuff. I'm not saying there isn't, but I think. Most of the writers I read, are people that are looking at why crime happens, rather than necessarily who done it. And I think it's something we're always going to be fascinated by, always.
It's a safe way to do it, isn't it? To disappear into a book or into a documentary.
Well, some people want escapism, some people want something else. As I say, I think there are a whole variety of reasons why people like crime drama and crime fiction.
So it's ongoing.
Yeah.
Did Val McDermid not say once that crime fiction was left-wing and thriller fiction was right-wing?
Well, thrillers mean a slightly different thing. I mean, thrillers in America tend to mean bombs and secret agents and all that kind of stuff.
Jack Reacher.
Yeah. I guess they, you know, Jason Bourne, Tom Clancy, all that kind of stuff. But I certainly would not mind if my novels were called thrillers. You want a crime novel to be thrilling, so you know, call it a cookbook. I really don't care. A thriller is...
Call it a cat mystery.
Yeah, no, definitely not a cat mystery. As long as you don't hurt a cat. That's one thing that crime writers all know. You can do whatever you want to a human being. I mean, it's very bizarre, this. Whatever you want to a human being, but you touch a hair on an animal's head and they will come after you, which is very strange. But there you go.
Okay, final question for all of you, one each. Present company accepted, favourite crime TV drama or detective?
You go.
TV.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Royal Television Society.
Yeah.
Oh, tricky, isn't it?
I loved Morse. I thought Morse was just... And apart from anything else, a massive jump in terms of television. Your 2 hour?
Yeah.
2 hour crime drama? Nobody's going to watch that.
John Thor,
you just take the phone off the hook.
Yeah.
This was back in the days when you had phone hooks. But that was just unmissable, that you could just... Something elegiac and slow and lovely.
Yeah.
I'm loving Slow Horses at the moment.
I love Slow Horses.
Apple,
Mick
which
Herron.
is based on the most phenomenal series of books, if anybody hasn't read them, by Mick Herron.
Jackson Lamb.
Brilliant, absolutely
fantastic.
brilliant.
Dan, you've got one?
The Wire is probably, I think The Wire is probably my favourite. I mean, it's difficult though. There's been so many great sort of crime dramas, haven't there?
It's interesting to hear the ones that pop straight into your mind when asked, I think.
It's Hill Street Blues.
Oh.
I still go back to Hill Street.
Yeah.
Change
Columbo.
Oh, yeah.
Best cop show ever made. There you go.
Columbo.
The best cop show ever made.
I've got the box set on DVD and I watch it in rotation.
Yeah.
And I'll put a Columbo on and then once I've got to the end of the series, I go back to number one.
See, that's proof, isn't it? The format is completely, there's no mystery.
Unbelievably revolutionary.
And yet,
Pilot was directed by Steven Spielberg. Stephen Bochco was involved, Jonathan Demme, all sorts of amazing people. And they go, no, we're going to show you who the killer is in the first 20 minutes. People are never going to watch that, eh?
Counterintuitive, isn't it?
Yes, fantastic.
Well, that's it, chaps. Just remains for me to thank you all,
Thank you.
Dan and Mark and Douglas, and to thank all of you for coming along this evening. And do tune in for this, as you can tell, cracking series, expertise behind and in front of the camera. And premiere date 25th April, and as Teresa said, available on those leading pay TV platforms, On Demand and Amazon Prime and Apple TV channels.